The Shika and the Zonai, two factions who revolutionized the Kingdom of Hyrule in their own respective ways. Despite being a fantasy world governed by swords and spears, Hyrule has been no stranger to the rise and fall of technologically advanced groups or societies over the course of its long history. In Skyward Sword, the earliest game in the chronology, we explored the remains of an elaborate mining operation spearheaded by autonomous robots. Both Minish Cap and Twilight Princess introduced an advanced civilization in the sky who left behind various relics of their impressive engineering skills. However, with the passage of time, these technical marvels would often disappear as if they never existed, and we're essentially back to medieval times again. Such is the case with Hyrule in the era of the Wild. Have you ever seen one of those quote-unquote documentaries that try to argue that human advancements in technology were influenced by aliens? Well, in the Zelda universe, this is actually kind of a reality, except instead of aliens, it's sky furries. The legacy and influence of the Zonai in Tears of the Kingdom is very similar to the ancient Sheikah in Breath of the Wild. Both factions were at the forefront of a technological revolution in Hyrule. Both constructed shrines and autonomous robots, and in each case something happened which caused their technology to fade from memory only to be unearthed many years later. The similarities are undeniable. However, these two groups lived tens of thousands of years apart. It's unlikely they ever even interacted with each other. And yet there's a number of overarching motifs which are found in both cultures. Things that are way too similar to be coincidental, like the Divine Beast helmets, which are almost a carbon copy of the helmets worn by the ancient sages. The motifs inside Tears of the Kingdom's 4 main dungeons, which are Zonai in origin and clearly what inspired the design of the Divine Beasts. The constellations found inside the imprisoning chamber and on Sheikah architecture, or the fact that the Sheikah shrines on the Great Plateau are in the exact same spot the Zonai shrines used to be back when the plateau served as Hyrule's main capital. I don't think it's a stretch or even a theory to say that the Zonai likely had a pretty big influence on the Sheikah. The Zelda team didn't exactly make a big secret out of this. However, due to the inclusion of time travel, it's possible that these influences go much further, and the Sheikah may have even inspired themselves to some degree. So today, let's explore the connections between the Zonai and the Sheikah, and see if we can fill in some of the missing time between the distant past, the less distant but still pretty ancient past, when the Sheikah were at their peak, and the present day, when it all came together to finally end the conflict that started tens of thousands of years ago. So let's get into it. I think it's only fitting that we start by outlining some of the established history. Creating a Champion presents a rough timeline of events leading up to Breath of the Wild, and according to this chronology, the Kingdom of Hyrule had practically been locked in a perpetual conflict with Ganondorf/Ganon. This is of course referring to the original Zelda timeline, where Ganon was defeated many times only to return again in some way, shape or form. It mentions Ganondorf's birth, his first transformation into his boar-like alter ego, which he didn't do in Tears of the Kingdom, and it even mentions one of the sages from Ocarina of Time, that being Princess Ruto. What follows is a significant time jump or gap, where nothing is documented, only for a sudden revolution to take place in which Hyrule transformed into a highly advanced society thanks to the Sheikah and their technology. So right away, there's a lot of missing time here. Hyrule went from a medieval kingdom locked in an endless skirmish with Ganon to a thriving, futuristic society. Meanwhile, Ganon himself changed from a cunning individual with a thirst for conquest to what is essentially a mindless force of nature, a pure embodiment of chaos and destruction. Now, up until recently, we could have made the argument that the distant past seen in Tears of the Kingdom is simply a reimagining of the original timeline. However, as most of you know by now, Hidemaru Fujibayashi, the series director, presents the possibility that it's not so much a reboot, but more so a reset. That at some point during or after the original timeline, the Hyrule we once knew was essentially destroyed, only to be re-established after the Zonai arrived. Nintendo has since even updated the timeline on the official Japanese Zelda website to include Breath of the Wild and its sequel at the very end. Of course, there's the whole question of which timeline branch do they follow up on, is it a convergence, all that jazz. But that's a topic for another time. Keeping Fujibayashi's statements in mind, it stands to reason that the arrival of the Zonai took place somewhere between the distant past, i.e. all the other games, and Hyrule's technological revolution sometime before the calamity of 10,000 years ago, when the Guardians, Divine Beasts, and Sheikah towers and shrines were created. This would explain why Hyrule evolved so rapidly in the technology department in the first place. Unlike the Sheikah tech, which was banned by the king after a victory over Ganon, the Zonai machinery did not receive the same treatment, at least not that we're aware of. Sure, it did fade from memory at some point, but that's because most of it is found in the sky and inside the depths, two places which became largely inaccessible and forgotten about by most. But there's clear indications that not all Zonai tech was lost and in fact may have been used as a blueprint by the Sheikah. After having played Tears of the Kingdom, it's become more and more obvious that the Sheikah from 10,000 years ago knew a lot more than they let on in the previous title. As an example, it's all but certain that they knew about the existence of the underworld. Most of the entrances to the depths formed or became accessible during the upheaval, with the exception of two: the secret passage below Hyrule Castle, which had been kept hidden by the royal family, and the hole inside the Yiga clan hideout. Master Koga explains that after falling down the hole in Breath of the Wild, he found himself in this new alien environment, and he's basically been down here all this time. From here, he and his fellow clan members have been exploring the world below Hyrule, building base camps and experimenting with the Zonai machines they found down here. The Yiga's obsession with the Zonai tech was quite interesting to see and actually quite fitting. After all, they are former Sheikah, a tribe known for being fascinated by science and technology, so their roots really shine through here. Either way, it shows that the hole inside their hideout was already connected to the depths before the events of Tears of the Kingdom's opening, which is significant because in Breath of the Wild's DLC it came to light that the Sheikah built some kind of mechanism at the bottom of the hole, one that reveals a Sheikah shrine. So yes, it's all but certain that the ancient Sheikah knew about the depths, which means they must have known about the Zonai technology as well, as there's an abundance of it all over the underworld. And it makes you wonder what other secrets they've been keeping from the public for the past millennia. If there's anything the ancient Sheikah were good at, it's digging. They buried massive towers and shrines deep below the earth, and in the most obscure locations. Even those giant columns that surround Hyrule Castle in Breath of the Wild, which according to Zelda's old diary were buried so deep that even after years of excavations in and around the castle, the Hylians were unable to locate them. The Sheikah also focused their attention in the opposite direction. The astral observatory inside Hyrule Castle and the giant telescopes found at the Sheikah Tech Labs indicate that they had a profound fascination with the sky and the heavenly bodies, and up until now it was never really explained why this was so important to them. With the introduction of the Zonai, a civilization that originates from the sky, this mystery might be one step closer to being solved. Perhaps the Sheikah were trying to establish contact with the Zonai or look for signs of their presence or guidance in some way. They may have even succeeded at some point, but if they did, they're not telling. It's implied that the Zonai didn't go extinct, they simply left for unexplained reasons, probably back to where they originally came from, and only Rauru and his sister Minoru stayed behind on the surface where, together with the Hylians, they would establish the new kingdom of Hyrule. Oh, and speaking of the Hylians, one thing that's interesting about the Sheikah in the era of the Wild is that, according to the profile section, they are classified as Hylians. This may seem trivial for those who started their Zelda journey with or after Breath of the Wild, but in previous games it wasn't entirely clear what the Sheikah are exactly, whether they belong to a different race altogether or if they're just an offshoot of the Hylians, or as the name suggests, a separate tribe. While they have always had pointy ears like the Hylians, they also possess some unique traits that set them apart, like their iconic crimson eyes and white hair, and the fact that they have an above average lifespan. But I guess now we know that they are in fact Hylian in origin, at least the ones from Breath of the Wild are. Just a different breed of Hylian with their own unique philosophy and traditions. Not only are they more spiritual than the average Hylian, they are much more efficient at keeping a record of historical events. For example, they are the only faction in Hyrule who are still in possession of documented evidence of the calamity from 10,000 years ago, the only surviving record that we know of. In Tears of the Kingdom, Impa refers to old Sheikah literature from Kakariko Village that documents the existence of the Dragon Tears, as well as the secret backroom inside the Forgotten Temple, which no one else seems to know about. So with that said, let's discuss what could have happened following the imprisoning war and how it led to Hyrule's massive leap in technology. Bear in mind that this section is highly speculative since, well, we're talking about at least 10,000 years of undocumented history here. It's worth pointing out that although the Sheikah have been present in Hyrule since pretty much the beginning, for the majority of the Zelda timeline they've sort of been teetering on the edge of extinction. Many of them died prior to the events of Ocarina of Time, during the infamous Hyrulean Civil War, and following the timeline split their presence has been negligible ever since, with only a few descendants or, in some cases, only their symbols showing up here and there. Hence it was quite surprising to see them pop up in such large numbers in Breath of the Wild. Suddenly there's a thriving village full of them, even more if you also also count the ancient monks and the Yiga. There are more Sheikah characters in this era than in all other games combined. Back in Raru's time, we saw Gorons, Rito, Gerudo, and Zora, but no representative of the Sheikah, not even among the sages. So it's unclear if the tribe who would go on to build the divine beasts and the towers and such were already established in this era. My guess is probably not. During my first playthrough, I was convinced that they would reveal that the Sheikah and the Zonai are related by blood somehow, and that the fifth sage would end up being Paya or maybe Pura, especially since the Sheikah were kind of on the sideline in this game. I think it would have been a cool plot twist, but unfortunately that's not what the writers ended up going with. So here's a scenario of what I think could have happened. Let's say hypothetically that Hyrule was indeed destroyed at some point during or after the original Zelda timeline, as Fujibayashi suggests. That of course doesn't mean that there weren't any survivors. It's not like when a kingdom and its monarchy collapses, everyone else goes with it. It's clear from some of the backstories that there were people living on the surface before the Zonai arrived. It's just that it wasn't a kingdom anymore at this point, and humans and the other surviving races were most likely living segregated into separate tribes and factions. If anything, the existence of Sonia proves that the royal family bloodline managed to survive the collapse of Old Hyrule, so I don't see why the same couldn't apply to the Sheikah as well. History has taught us that the people of Hyrule are extremely resilient. No matter how big of a cataclysm strikes, there's always those who persist and manage to pass down knowledge and traditions, the Wind Waker being a prime example of that, as is Breath of the Wild. Anyway, since the Sheikah are officially classified as Hylians, it's possible that among Rauru and Sonia's many human followers, there were some who shared a blood connection to the Sheikah from Old Hyrule, and are basically the ancestors of what would eventually become the Sheikah in the Era of the Wild. In one of the cutscenes, we see a guy who not only has white hair despite looking relatively young, but also appears to have a different eye color from the other soldiers. It's kinda hard to see if his eyes are actually red, but they're definitely not blue or green, which is by far the most dominant eye color among Hylians. Even Rauru and his sister have blue eyes. When the Zonai came down from the heavens bringing with them knowledge, technology, and magical artifacts like the secret stones, they were essentially revered as gods by the surface dwellers. And from here we have a pretty good idea of what happened next. The Zonai departed again at some point, save for Rauru and Minoru. Rauru then marries Sonia and a new kingdom is established which, with the exception of the Gerudo, most races seem to have sworn fealty to. What follows are the events we know from Tears of the Kingdom's memories. Ganondorf's attack on the kingdom, Sonia's death, and finally the imprisoning war, which ends in Raru's sacrifice and Zelda's draconification. From this point, history becomes open to interpretation as there's not a whole lot of information available. There's only a few things we know for sure. The Zonai Temple of Time and parts of the surrounding land were lifted up into the heavens by the sages, and along with it the construct who safeguards the Purapad. Hyrule Castle would be built on top of the imprisoning chamber, a map outlining the location of Zelda's memories was created and hidden away inside the Forgotten Temple, Typhlo Ruins was turned into a memorial site for the sages, and at some point the Great Plateau was completely refurbished. Its walls were renovated and brought in line with the more modern Hylian stonework, and a new Temple of Time was erected in the same exact spot where its Zonai equivalent once stood. There's also signs that, for whatever reason, old Zonai architecture on the surface was also renovated and given a new look. Proof of this can be found at the Zonai ruins in Faron and most notably at Tobio's Hollow. Here we find structures whose outer shell is made up of the green Zonai stonework we first saw in Breath of the Wild, while its inner core contains the grey Zonai stonework we see in the underworld and in the sky. It's not entirely clear who did this, when they did it and why, but it's an interesting detail either way. I suspect that following Rauru and Sonia's death and Zelda's draconification, there may have been a sort of divide amongst the Hylian population. A divide between those who wanted to start fresh and establish a new culture, and those who wanted to continue the legacy of the Zonai by building upon it. The former turned into the conventional Hylians with a new monarchy, their fancy castles, strongholds, and garrisons, and the latter turned into the Sheikah, who continued to experiment and expand upon the knowledge of the Zonai, particularly in the technology department. This divide probably happened gradually over time and wasn't immediate, nor was it hostile in nature like with the split between the Sheikah and the Yiga, at least not initially. Instead, these were simply two different philosophies coexisting and working together. The foundation of Hyrule Castle shows that its construction was a collaborative effort between the Hylians and the Sheikah, which is evident from the Astral Observatory located at the heart of the castle, as well as all the other Sheikah-related activities like the 5 massive columns which were part of an elaborate security system. Obviously, the Hylians would never allow stuff like this to be built inside their own capital if there were tensions between the two. In my video about the upheaval, we talked about that upside-down pyramid located on the ceiling of the imprisoning chamber, which according to the game's files is called a Purification unit. We know for a fact that this structure didn't exist yet during Raru's sacrifice, so it was most definitely built sometime after. The most striking detail about about the unit are the constellations, which are eerily similar to the ones on Sheikah architecture, and it's probably the first sign of the emergence of Sheikah culture in this era. As for its main purpose, I think the name kinda speaks for itself. Purification is the process of extracting something from a substance, leaving you with something else. Ever since Breath of the Wild, it's been hinted that there's a connection between malice, spirit energy or life force, and the blue ancient energy that powers the Sheikah technology. For example, in addition to ancient energy, the divine beasts also require the life force of a pilot to stay operational. And of course, it's been shown that malice can also interface with the Sheikah tech, which makes sense if all three substances are based on the same principle, that being life force or just force as it's known in Japanese. Both Raru's green energy and Ganon's malice are seen moving up and into the ceiling, and while the green energy sort of coils around it, the malice moves in a steady stream all the way from Ganondorf's corpse straight into the tip of the Purification unit. As such, the most obvious answer is that the Purification unit is somehow turning one or both of these two substances into a new compound, which I think could very well be ancient energy. And this has actually been a long-running theory. As early as 2019, Nintendo Black Crisis, in collaboration with Zeltic, proposed that Ganondorf's body may have been used as a kind of fuel source ever since his imprisonment, which was not only a novel idea for the time, especially given how little we knew about the sequel back then, but it actually has more credence now. Creating a Champion explains that the biggest pocket of ancient energy is located below Hyrule Castle, which is why the castle has long served as ground zero for the Sheikah's experiments. The book also mentions a central control unit that supplies power to many of the Sheikah structures across Hyrule. It was even used as a plot device in Age of Calamity, where Ganon shuts down the control unit, causing the Sheikah towers to lose power temporarily. But we never saw this device with our own eyes. That is, unless the Purification unit is the central control unit. It was never really explained why the castle specifically was such a hotspot for ancient energy. There were signs that there was something peculiar about the castle, especially underneath it, but without further context we didn't really know what to make of it. The sequel, however, ties everything together and allows for a more solid theory. Tears of the Kingdom provides additional evidence that spirit energy and ancient energy are closely related to each other, because when you upgrade the energy cells on your Zonai battery for a second time, they change from green to blue, making them last longer. My personal take is that ancient energy is a more refined, more powerful form of the green Zonai energy, perhaps made possible by adding purified malice to the mix. I think the Sheikah realized early on that the immense energy being expelled from Ganondorf's seal could be harnessed instead of letting it go to waste, and so they built a device capable of absorbing malice and removing Ganondorf's evil essence from it, essentially turning Hyrule Castle into a massive power plant. Even the art of mummification the Sheikah monks practiced could very well have been the result of them studying the process that preserves Ganondorf's body, and found a way to prolong their own lifespan for thousands of years by essentially mimicking the seal, which, if true, is even more proof that the ancient Sheikah monks knew a great deal more about Hyrule's history than they were willing to share in Breath of the Wild. I do believe that the modern-day Sheikah genuinely had no idea about the true origin of ancient energy. That knowledge does seem to have been lost at some point, perhaps due to the king's persecution of the Sheikah, which forced them to abandon their research altogether. But before that, I think the Sheikah knew exactly where their fuel was coming from. I mean, by all accounts, they are the ones who engineered it in the first place. Some may see the Sheikah tech as inferior to that of the Zonai because of stuff like Ultra Hand, which is convenient for sure, but I'd argue that the opposite is true. As impressive as the Zonai technology is, nothing we see in Tears of the Kingdom holds a candle to the marvels of engineering that are the divine beasts. These behemoths are on a whole different level compared to the automata the Zonai were building, and it only makes sense since the Sheikah had thousands of years to improve upon the Zonai technology. Of course, that doesn't take away from the fact that the Zonai provided the building blocks, the blueprints that inspired the Sheikah. I think inspiration is the key word here. It's obvious that the Sheikah adapted a lot of things from the Zonai, from the design of the divine beasts to their power source. Heck, even their symbols look alike. Of course, the Sheikah eye symbol has been around since before Skyward Sword, so it's difficult to tell if the similarities are a coincidence or not, but either way, it's yet another interesting connection between the two. Unfortunately, it's impossible to know all the things that happened during Hyrule's technological golden age. There's just too much undocumented history between the end of the imprisoning war and the calamity of 10,000 years ago. But I'd like to imagine that the Sheikah tech was initially used primarily for convenience. You know, transportation, automation, robotic servants, stuff like that, which is likely why the Hylians initially seemed content with letting the Sheikah go about their business. But as we all know, there did come a time when the Hylian royal family grew more and more anxious about the stuff the Sheikah were doing, which ultimately led to a complete ban on all Sheikah technology. And I think this all started the moment the Sheikah started turning their machines into weapons. There's no doubt that the weaponized Sheikah tech played a crucial role in the victory over Ganon. However, it also exposed how powerful the Sheikah had truly become. It's told that during the conflict with Ganon, one of the divine beasts managed to blow a hole clean through an entire mountain, giving Mount Hebra its iconic look. Witnessing the awesome, destructive force of these machines, it's understandable that the king would be a little worried about the future of his kingdom. I'm not taking sides and claim that the persecution of the Sheikah was justified, but I mean, I do see where the guy was coming from. The divine beasts were like the equivalent of the introduction of the atomic bomb in this universe, and the Sheikah were the ones holding the launch codes. If misused, they could vaporize entire armies and villages, and thus thousands of years of innovation were thrown by the wayside, buried and forgotten until the next calamity, and well, the rest is history. One last thing I want to touch upon before we move on to my final thoughts is the possible effect time travel may have had on the ancient past. I can easily see that Zelda bringing the Purapad to the past with her could have had somewhat of an effect on Hyrule's history. After all, it's kinda like bringing a smartphone back to before smartphones were invented. As such, the fact that the Purapad and the original Sheikah slate are suspiciously similar in both design and functionality might not be a coincidence, meaning the Sheikah could have accidentally inspired their own technology to some degree. Of course, the Sheikah could not have reversed engineered the Purapad, because it was sent into the sky shortly after Zelda's draconification, and from what we can tell, it's been there all this time. However, Zelda did give Minoru the opportunity to study the Purapad for a while. She is portrayed as someone who collects and preserves knowledge. Her massive library is a testament to that. We don't really get a clear picture where this library is located, but my best guess is that it was somewhere inside Raru's castle on the Great Plateau. It was sort of like the equivalent of Hyrule Castle in this age, and just like Hyrule Castle, it only makes sense that this is where they kept their knowledge. Just to be sure, I thoroughly checked every inch of Dragonhead Island, the Construct Factory, and the Spirit Temple, since these are all places that are also connected to Minoru. But there's nothing that matches the library. The Zonai Castle is a bit of a mystery in and of itself, because unlike the Zonai Temple of Time, the castle is nowhere to be found in the present day. Not in the sky, not on the surface, or in the underworld. As far as I know, it's the only place from Zelda's memories we never get to explore in-game, and thus the most likely candidate for the location of Minoru's library. We know the castle wasn't destroyed during the imprisoning war. You can see it standing in the background intact right before Zelda turns into the Light Dragon. So where did it go? Well, seeing as the walls of the plateau were completely refurbished, I think the most likely option is that it was simply taken down by the Hylians at some point. If this is true, it's also possible that the knowledge kept in Minoru's library could have been preserved before the building was dismantled. And among these many books, there could have been records of Minoru's study into the Purapad, which the Sheikah could have used to build their own. We also know that at least some of the survivors of the imprisoning war knew about the Purapad's existence and even what it looked like, seeing as there's an image of it carved into the map and on the wall of the Forgotten Temple. So did the Sheikah inspire themselves? Nobody knows for sure, but I do think it would be a pretty amazing plot point. As far as connections between the Zonai and the Sheikah go, there's a lot more to cover, like how the Shrine of Resurrection was built right below the spot where Raru's castle once stood. But just like with the Zonai and Sheikah eye symbols, it's hard to tell if some of these are deliberate or just a coincidence. I do think there may have been an attempt at a sort of cover-up. We talked before about the Zonai ruins on the surface and how they seem to have been refurbished to look different. I'm not sure what the intent behind it was, whether it was to obscure the history of the Zonai or if there was some other motive, but it is an interesting detail. I know some people believe that the Sheikah might be descendants of the Zonai, given Raru and Minoru's white hair, but personally I'm not really convinced. Zelda does seem to have a Zonai blood connection since she possesses both Raru and Sonia's powers, and the ancient hero looks like he could have been some sort of Zonai hybrid, but I find it hard to believe that the same goes for the Sheikah as well. In my mind, the Sheikah had a more spiritual or philosophical connection to the Zonai rather than a genetic one. They clearly paid a lot of tribute to their culture and overall were much more adamant to preserve the Zonai's history, which is in stark contrast to the Hylians who seem to have been more focused on rebranding their culture. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this, so don't hesitate to leave your theories on the Zonai and the Sheikah in the comments below. I'm sure there's stuff I missed, so maybe there's even more to this mystery. Now, before I take my leave, I have kind of a special announcement to make. Up until now, I haven't done anything with the channel regarding merch, and I initially intended to keep it that way. No disrespect to other creators, but personally, it somehow felt wrong to have some third party crank out a couple of t-shirts and mugs from an assembly line in God knows which country. Aside from taking a cut, I would be barely involved. I mean, I don't know how to make t-shirts. However, it just so happens that over the past year, my fiance has gotten way into crafting and smithing, and she's pretty darn good at it too. So we figured maybe that's something we could do for the channel. These are all made in-house, which makes it a lot more personal. Now, I will be upfront and say these are not your typical mass-produced Zelda jewelry you can get from AliExpress for a couple of bucks. This is all handcrafted from real silver, which means every piece is unique, but it also means they are definitely not as cheap. However, if you have the money to spare and enjoy Zelda-themed jewelry, you can support our household and my fiance's hobby by picking one up for yourself. We're also in the process of creating Monster Maze pins for those who, actually want to own something with my logo on it. These are going to be cheap because they are 3D printed. I did model it myself, they come from our 3D printer in our workshop and are hand painted and encased in resin by my fiance afterwards. I'll put a link to all of this stuff in the description and in the pinned comment in case any of you are interested. And with that, I have said all I wanted to say. Thank you as always for your continuous support and viewership, and a special thanks to Heather, Blue, Ren, Vranicat, James Covenant, and all my other Patreons and channel members. That is all for now, and I hope to see you all next time.